Some men, when grief and pain have stripped them down to the bone, simply lie down and decide to disappear. They do not die all at once. They die slowly, a little each day, turning their face to the wall and refusing the world that hurt them. In the high country of Montana, in a ranch house at the edge of a town called Larkspur, there was a man doing exactly that. His name was Tobias Hale, and he had not stood on his own 2 feet in nearly 6 months. He was 35, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had once broken wild horses and mended fences from dawn until dark. But a winter wagon accident had shattered the bone in his right leg and taken the life of his young wife, Ruth, in the same cruel hour. The leg had knitted slow and wrong. The wound in his heart had not knitted at all, and so he lay in a darkened room at the end of a hall, eating almost nothing, speaking to no one, waiting quietly for the silence to finish what the accident had started. What he did not know, what he could not have known that gray spring morning, was that a woman was already on a stagecoach bound for Larkspur, a widow with a worn carpetbag and a wooden spoon wrapped in a flour sack. She was coming to cook, and before the season turned, the smell of something simmering on his cold stove would do what every doctor in the territory could not: stay close. And before we begin, let us know in the comments tonight, where in the world are you listening from? This story is for anyone who has ever believed that a warm meal, set down by steady hands, can call a person back from the very edge. The stagecoach rolled into Larkspur, Montana, caked in the pale dust of the spring roads. It was April of 1887, the cottonwoods along the creek just unfurling their first soft green. Della Wren stepped down onto the boardwalk and pressed a hand to the small of her aching back. She was 31, tall and plainly built, with chestnut hair beneath a faded blue bonnet and a face that had learned long ago to keep its disappointments to itself. She had buried her own husband 2 winters back, a fever that took him in a single hard week, and with him went the little boarding house in Kansas City where she had cooked for a dozen lodgers. The bank had taken the rest. When she saw the notice tacked to a church board, cook and housekeeper wanted, Hale Ranch, Larkspur, fair wage, hard honest work, she had written that very evening. A man named Amos Teal had written back. His letter was short and plain. "The house has had sorrow in it," he wrote. "I will not pretend otherwise, but you will be fed, paid, and let be." That honesty was the reason she came. Amos was waiting beside a buckboard wagon, an old foreman with a white mustache and a tired stoop in his shoulders. He took her bag without ceremony. "Miss Wren," he said, "thank you for coming all this way." "Mr. Teal," she climbed up onto the seat beside him, "tell me plainly what I am walking into." He was quiet a moment, clucking the team into motion. Then he told her, and by the time the wagon rolled out toward the blue foothills, Della understood she was not coming to keep an ordinary house at all. The Hale Ranch sat in a green fold of hills, the mountains rising behind it. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it had the stillness of a place holding its breath. The yard was tidy but weary, and the few hands among the corrals moved softly, the way men move in a house where someone is dying. Inside, the air was close and stale, dust, cold ashes, the sour shut-in smell of a sick room. The curtains were drawn against the day, and a fine gray grit lay over the table, the shelves, the cold black stove. Ruth Hale's touch was still everywhere: a faded sampler on the wall, a row of empty canning jars, a folded quilt over a chair, and all of it had gone gray with neglect. "He is down the hall," Amos said, lowering his voice. "Last door. The doctor set the leg as best he could, but Tobias will not put weight on it, will not even try, and mostly he will not eat." The old man rubbed a hand over his face. "I have buried men with more meat on their bones than that boy is carrying now. The hands try. I try. He turns us all away at the door." Della set her carpetbag down on the clean-swept floor and untied her bonnet. "Where's the kitchen?" Amos blinked, as though he had braced himself for questions, for argument, for anything but that. Then he pointed, and Della Wren walked into the cold, dead kitchen of the Hale Ranch and quietly began to roll up her sleeves. She did not yet know that the man behind that last door would not so much as look at her for 9 long days. She began with the stove, blacked it, scoured it, coaxed a fire to life in its iron belly until it ticked and breathed with heat. She threw open the windows to the spring air and beat the dust from the curtains until the sun came through and scrubbed the long table until the pale grain of the wood showed again. By the second day, the kitchen no longer smelled of neglect. It smelled of lye soap and wood smoke, and faintly of something like hope, and then she cooked. She had brought a few things of her own, dried herbs in twists of paper, the jar of sourdough kept alive across 1,000 miles, her mother's spoon worn smooth as a river stone. From the cellar, she dug onions and potatoes, gone soft, but still good. Amos brought her a side of beef and a sack of barley, and Della Wren set to the one thing she had ever truly known how to do in this world. She set to feeding people. The ranch hands noticed it first. Men who had been gnawing cold biscuits and hard jerky for half a year came in at noon to find a steaming pot of beef and barley soup and a tray of biscuits fresh from the oven. They ate like half-starved wolves and thanked her with their hats in their hands. Amos ate 2 full bowls and turned his face to the window so she would not see it working. Each evening, she fixed a tray, a bowl of broth, a soft buttered biscuit, a cup of sweet tea, and carried it down the dark hall to the last door. Each evening she knocked softly and said, "Supper, Mr. Hale," and each evening there came no answer at all. She would leave the tray on the little stool outside his door, and each morning she would take it away untouched, the broth gone cold and filmed over. She did not scold him, did not plead. She simply tried again the next day and the next. But on the 9th night, as she bent to set the tray down, she heard through the door the sound of a grown man weeping, low and broken and trying hard not to be heard. And Della Wren stood very still in that dark hallway and understood all at once that the man behind the door was not refusing her food. He was refusing to be alive. The next morning, Della did not leave the tray and walk away. She set it on the stool, lowered herself to the bare floor of the hallway, her back against the wall beside his door, and began, very quietly, to talk. She did not speak of his leg, or of Ruth, or of the accident. She talked instead about Kansas City, about the lodgers she had cooked for over the years, the railway clerk who wept over a plate of her apple dumplings because they tasted of his mother's, the old German who swore her bread had cured his rheumatism. She talked about her own husband, gone 2 winters now, and how the cruelest part of grief was never the missing of him, but the way the whole world seemed to expect her to lie down beside it and stop. "I did not," she said softly to the closed door. "Some mornings, Lord knows, I wanted to, but there were always people needing fed, and a body cannot cook lying down." She paused, resting her head back against the wall. "I expect you have got people needing you too, Mr. Hale, out there in the cold, doing your work for you, waiting on you to come back." There was no answer. There never was. But that evening, when she came to collect the tray, the cup of broth had been drained empty. It was not much, a few swallows of broth. But Della Wren held that empty cup as though it were beaten gold, and for the first time since Kansas City, she let herself weep, not from sorrow, but from the fierce, stubborn first stirring of hope. She said nothing to Amos. She only cooked the harder, and the trays began to come back changed, a biscuit gone, the soup half eaten, the tea drunk to the dregs. By inches, behind that shut door, a starving man was choosing to eat. But the door stayed closed, and the bad leg stayed still beneath its blanket, and Della knew that broth alone would never raise him up. That would take something stronger. That would take a reason. So she made the stew. She started it before dawn on a cold, bright morning when the frost still lay silver along the corral rails. She browned the beef slow and patient in the bottom of the heavy iron pot until it was dark and crusted, and the whole kitchen filled with a deep, savory smell. She softened onions in the drippings until they turned sweet and gold. She added clean water from the well, and barley and potatoes and carrots from the cellar, a single bay leaf, a pinch of thyme she had dried herself, and a long, slow grind of black pepper. Then she set the lid just ajar and let it murmur on the back of the hot stove the whole morning long. It was the kind of cooking that cannot be hurried, the kind her mother had taught her at the elbow. Patience, Della. Patience is the only seasoning that truly matters. Hour by hour, the stew thickened and deepened, and the rich smell of it filled the kitchen, then crept down the hall, then filled the whole tired house to its rafters. It was a smell of Sunday tables and full bellies and good long years. It was plainly the smell of being alive, and it slipped at last beneath that closed door at the end of the hall. Amos came in at noon and stopped dead in the doorway, his nose lifted like an old hound's. "Lord above," he murmured, almost to himself, "I have not smelled the like of that since Ruth was—" He stopped short, cleared his throat, sat down heavy at the long table without finishing it. Della ladled him out a steaming bowl, and just as she set the spoon down beside it, they both heard the sound. A sound from the hallway. Not the dry shuffle of slippered feet, something worse, and something far better. The slow, dragging, agonized sound of a man hauling himself upright against a wall, a low grunt of pain, the heavy, uneven thud of a single, unsteady step. And then another after it. Amos started up out of his chair. Della caught his wrist and held it. "Let him," she whispered. "Let him come on his own." The footsteps came on down the hall, halting and terrible and stubborn, a long pause at the end of it, and then Tobias Hale appeared in the kitchen doorway, clinging to the frame with both his hands. He was a ruin of the man he had been, gaunt and gray, his shirt hanging loose, his bad leg shaking beneath him, his face slick with the sweat of crossing 20 feet of floor. He had not stood upright in nearly 6 months, but he was standing now, and his sunken eyes were fixed not on Amos, not on Della, but on the great black pot breathing its steam into the bright morning light. He drew one long, shaking breath, and in a voice cracked and rusted from long disuse, scarcely more than a whisper, Tobias Hale said the words, "That stew could raise the dead." Then his good leg buckled, and Della was across the kitchen before he struck the floor, catching him under the arms, taking his whole weight, easing him into the chair beside the warm stove. He was light as a bundle of kindling, trembling head to foot, and he was here, out of that dark room, in the warm and the light, for the first time since the winter took everything he had. She made no fuss. She ladled a bowl of the stew, set it before him, and gently folded his shaking hands around the spoon. "Eat, Mr. Hale," she said, very soft. "There is plenty," and he ate. He could not have known how the smell of one widow's stew would unstitch 6 months of his stubborn dying, but it had, and from that day on, though no one in the house ever spoke of it aloud, the whole place began, slowly, to turn. Tobias came to the kitchen again the next day, and the day after. At first, Amos half carried him down the hall. Then he managed with a cane the foreman carved him from ash wood. Then, by slow and gritted degrees, on his own 2 feet. The leg would always pain him, always carry a limp, but it carried him. And each meal left him a few steps stronger than the last, as though the woman's cooking were laying down new bone where the doctors never could. He began to talk, haltingly at first, then more freely. He told her about Ruth, one still evening, when the lamps were turned low, how she had laughed too loud and sung off-key and filled the whole house with a brightness he had been sure had died alongside her. "I figured," he admitted, his voice rough as gravel, "that if I just lay still enough, long enough, I would follow her on out. I was not brave enough to be quick about it, so I set about doing it slow." He looked down at the worn wooden spoon in Della's hand. "And then you came and made the house smell like the living again, made a man feel near rude for keeping on dying in it." Della understood that far better than he knew, and she told him of her own husband and her own long climb up out of grief. 2 people who had each been buried alive by sorrow, sitting in a warm kitchen, slowly digging one another back out into the light. The seasons turned over. The green of spring deepened into the gold of summer, and the Hale Ranch came back to life right along with its master. Tobias was up in the saddle again by July, riding slow and careful, but riding. Ruth's faded sampler still hung on the kitchen wall, but it no longer looked like a tombstone. It looked now more like a quiet word of thanks. And somewhere amid all those shared meals and quiet evenings, something else had taken root, unspoken, unhurried, and altogether real. It was there in the way Tobias saved the chair at his right hand at supper, in the way Della's hand lingered when she set down his coffee, in the small things he began to carve for her from scraps of pine and leave by her place, without a word, a little bird with its wings half spread, a long-handled spoon to match her mother's old one. One evening, in the gold light of a late summer dusk, Tobias set down his fork and said it plainly. "I did not hire you on to be a cook forever, Della. Leastways, I am hoping you might consider being more than that, being a part of this place." He swallowed hard. "Being a part of me. If you would have a broke-down rancher with a bad leg and a house that used to be full of ghosts he has finally learned to live alongside." Della Wren looked at the man who had dragged himself out of a grave just to taste her stew and felt the very last of her own grief loosen its grip and let go. "I have been a part of it," she said, "since the night the broth came back to me empty." They were married that autumn, beneath the turning cottonwoods by the creek, with Amos standing proud beside Tobias and the hands scrubbed and grinning in their Sunday best. Della wore a sprig of her own thyme in her hair. A long table was set out in the yard, heaped with everything she had ever learned to make, and for the first time in more years than anyone could count, the Hale Ranch rang with laughter loud enough to wake the Blue Hills. Some loves arrive all at once, like a clap of summer lightning, but the truest ones, more often than not, arrive the way warmth steals into a cold house, slowly from the kitchen outward, until one ordinary day you look up and find the whole place glowing, and cannot remember how you ever lived so long in the dark. Tobias Hale had lain down to die, and a widow with a worn wooden spoon had called him back, not with medicine and not with pity, but with the plain, stubborn love of a meal made for someone worth the feeding. He learned to walk again. He learned, harder still, to live again. And he never forgot the morning he dragged himself down that dark hall, following the smell of something simmering, and found his whole life waiting for him in a warm, sunlit kitchen. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us tonight. If this story warmed something in you, we would be ever so grateful if you would subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from. And may there always be something good on the stove, and someone you love waiting for you at the table.